Welcome to the 2:15 session at the 2024 Conference on the Environment. This is the all combined session with two presentations on New York State initiatives. The first, we're going to hear from Bryan, Ellis, and Jeffrey Mapes at the Division of Lands and Forests in Albany, DEC, to talk about 30 by 30. And then partway through, we'll shift gears, and then I'll do an introduction to Jennifer once the DEC 30 by 30 section is done. So Jeff's got the screen. Jeff and Bryan are both there. I'm going to mute and turn it over to them. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Jeff Mapes with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Bryan are both in the Division of Lands and Forests and work in the Forest Preserve and Conservation Easement section, or Bureau, sorry. So we're here to talk a little bit about the state's 30 by 30 effort. We'll start off here. This quote is kind of the main policy statement within the legislation that was passed in 2022, making it the goal of the state to help with both national and international efforts to conserve at least 30% of the U.S. Lands and inland waters and ocean areas by 2030. So 30 by 30 started off as from the biodiversity conservation world. And so the UN Convention on Biodiversity, or CBD in the slide here, started looking at biodiversity conservation back in 1992, and through a couple of strategic 10-year plans from 2002 to 2010 and then 2011 to 2020, worked on biodiversity conservation. And then as the second of those strategic plans wrapped up, discussion focused on what to do next, and what came out of that was in 2022, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted by 196 countries, including the U.S. And one of the targets of that is the 30 by 30 goal of conserving 30% of the lands and waters of the world by 2030. So around that same time, New York, well, on a U.S. national level, in 2021, shortly after President Biden took office, through an executive order, he made it the policy of the United States to participate in the 30 by 30 goal, and charged several federal agencies with moving that goal forward. And then the following year, New York State passed legislation to make it the policy of New York State to participate in that 30 by 30 goal. And that was signed by Governor Hochul in December of 2022. So currently there's about 10 states participating in 30 by 30, 7 through legislation or executive order. So that's California, Hawaii, Maryland, Nevada, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont. And then 3 has set a 30 by 30 goal through their climate adaptation plans. So Michigan, Maine, and Massachusetts. And that's where we come to the 10 states. And so to focus on New York's 30 by 30 legislation. It charges DEC and the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation to together develop strategies and a methodology to achieve the goal. And then it instructs the agencies to consider, but not limited to, coordinating with the State Land Acquisition Plan, better known as the state's Open Space Conservation Plan, protecting wetlands, looking at habitat protection and connectivity, looking at equitable outdoor access, considering a diversity of landscapes, considering economic sustainability and food security, and consulting with the Department of Agriculture and Markets on that matter, increasing climate resilience, collaborating with federal and state research institutions to provide innovative scientific observation, ensuring public input and involvement, and collaborating with tribal partners, and of course participating in regional, national, and international efforts for 30 by 30. So our timeline for implementing this legislation. So on July 1st of this year, we released the strategies and methodology document for public comment. That was a draft document, and there was a public comment period for 60 days that ended on August 30th. And during that time period, we had 2 separate public meetings, virtual public meetings during that period. So this fall, we're working on updating the strategies and incorporating it incorporating 30 by 30 into the Open Space Conservation Plan. Included in that will be summarizing and responding to the public comments that we received. So we received a good number of public comments, several hundred. So we'll be addressing those in a final document later this year or early next. And then through 2030, we'll be implementing the strategies and working to reach the goal of 30 by 30. During that time, we'll be tracking the metrics that we set up, and those will be available through DEC's website. And then on January 1st, there's a sunset clause in the legislation, but we expect that with it incorporated in the Open Space Conservation Plan, that we'll continue with protecting biodiversity after that date. So in the draft strategies and methodology, our first matter is to define what we're counting, because it's difficult to understand where you are if you don't understand what you're counting. So basically it includes land and water conservation achieved through various levels of government, nonprofits, as well as private ownership. And the protection can be both in permanent or persistent form. I'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. So we have 2 different types of conservation. So permanent is looking at lands that are held by government or nonprofits in what's called in fee simple. So the entity owns all of the rights for the property. And then also conservation easements as defined in the state environmental conservation law, Article 49. And that is where only partial rights to the property are held by a government or a nonprofit. And then the remaining rights are held by a private landowner. And then persistent conservation is through regulatory, so freshwater wetlands and tidal wetlands, public cemeteries, and then also tax incentives that have a time commitment or some other incentive form with a time commitment attached. So the forest tax law is one example where there's a 10-year commitment for taking that tax reduction in any given year. And then there's the Federal Conservation Reserve Program that provides a lease payment to the landowner for taking land out of agricultural production and doing some restoration efforts, sometimes fencing livestock out of stream areas and restoring the stream bank. And then marine protected areas aren't persistent because they are legislatively done and legislation can be changed over time. So let me turn to the methodology, and this provides some basic tenets of how we plan to go about implementing the strategies. So we'll talk about in just a moment. So we're going to collect data from various different sources to help with making decisions on how we implement the 30 by 30 goals. We're going to seek input and collaboration from public, academia, non-for-profit partners, and various other stakeholders. We'll recognize Indigenous cultures and practices and seek to collaborate with state and federally recognized Indian nations to achieve shared goals as they relate to 30 by 30. Supporting and prioritizing projects with a net benefit to disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, and then communicating with the public to provide opportunities for meaningful input and to ensure a transparent process and share our progress as we move forward. So into the meat and potatoes of it, the strategies for achieving 30 by 30. Strategy 1, we're going to look at existing state programs and evaluate them and see how we can improve and expand their impact to help achieve the goals of 30 by 30. So some of these will be looking at grant programs or other conservation programs as well. And then strategy 2 is identifying gaps in existing state programs and developing new ones to fit those or to fill those gaps, and seeking to support our conservation partners, because we'll get into the numbers in a moment and you'll see that reaching 30 by 30 is a big undertaking, and we're going to need some partners to be able to get there. And then strategy 3 is looking at providing recommendations for legislative and regulatory initiatives and changes. So these would require, as it says, changes to legislation to implement new programs, or regulatory changes to help move existing or new programs forward. So where are we now? To look at a baseline based on the definition that that DEC and Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation put forward in the draft strategies and methodology. We looked at the data that we have available and looking at the best of that data. So for a lot of it, we went to the New York Protected Areas database that's managed by the New York Natural Heritage Program and seeks to get data on lands held for conservation purposes in fee title or conservation easement. And then we pulled in data on forest tax law and wetlands and marine protected areas. And of course, some of these overlap. You can have on one parcel, it could be subject to a conservation easement. It could also be enrolled in forest tax law, and part of it may be a regulated wetland. So in an effort not to double count, we utilize GIS to set up a hierarchy. So if a property is counted as a conservation easement already, it's not then going to be also counted as forest tax law and a regulated wetland. It'll only be counted as a conservation easement. So when you look at this chart, know that some of the numbers as you get into the regulated wetlands and forest tax law, those numbers are going to look smaller than you might expect just looking at the individual program. So we have about, in forest tax law, there's about 1.3 million acres statewide. And in this chart, there's only just shy of 386,000 acres. That's because the rest of the acres are already being counted as conservation easement in most cases. So to give you all an idea of where we are overall, so you can see here that a little shy of 22% is conserved based on the data that we have. The land area in New York is 30,989,790 acres, so just shy of 31 million. And then what's called the jurisdictional boundary, which includes the waters off the shores of New York that are part of New York's purview, puts us at 34,918,885 acres. So a little shy of 35 million acres. And so the difference there is just shy of 4 million acres between the land and the jurisdictional boundary. So we're, for the purposes of 30 by 30, because we're including water in that, we're more looking at the 35 million acre figure for the jurisdictional boundary. And I'll show you a map in just a moment. It'll be a little clearer as far as what I'm talking about there. So if we take 30% of just shy of 35 million, that puts us around 10 million acres. And so that 7.6 million acre figure at the bottom right of the table is about 2.8 million acres shy, or 2,836,161 acres shy of reaching 30%. So we have a ways to go to get to 30% by 2030. One other note on this table, you'll see the line for the APA freshwater wetlands. That's the Adirondack Park Agency. And the park agency regulates wetlands within the Adirondack Park boundary, and then DEC regulates the rest of the freshwater wetlands outside of that area, which is all in the freshwater wetlands line. So to give you a little visual, the jurisdictional boundary, hopefully you all can see my pointer here. But basically, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, that black line that's kind of out in the middle, it also serves as the international boundary between the US and Canada. That area is added to the land area to be the jurisdictional boundary, as well as the Long Island Sound and Atlantic coast. Add some acreage to the jurisdictional area for the state down off Long Island. And sorry, so this map shows the conserved waters in dark blue. You get into wetlands, there's a few other classifications that fit in that as well. And then this is looking at the land. Conserved waters are still here, but we're more focused on the land area that's conserved. So we basically have a couple of main categories. Our dark green are owned in fee by government agencies or conservation non-for-profits, also known as land trusts. And then the purple are conservation easements. A lot of what you see is owned by DEC, especially up in the Adirondack Park area. And then there's some other conserved lands worked in here as well. So that gets into some of the forest tax law areas that are outside of conservation easements. One item to note here, we did not include the proclamation lands. So Fort Drum is an example of proclamation land. We didn't include that as conserved in this particular map. So today we're talking about the Tug Hill. So here's basically that same map zoomed in to the Tug Hill area, and we added the kind of the light yellow Tug Hill area here. See some state lands in here, as well as other protected lands, and some conservation easement areas as well. Then we did another map that's a little bit different look, that gets a little deeper into the freshwater wetlands, and you'll see in the dark green here, there's some forest tax law pieces, and I'll note that those are ones that are not subject to a conservation easement, and that we based our information on forest tax law is based on the tax parcel, and it is possible to enroll only a part of a tax parcel, so there may be pieces that are excluded. So just to note that representation is not completely and totally accurate, but it's our best representation that we have at the moment. So some factors with 30 by 30 and how they apply to the Tug Hill region. Certainly, the Tug Hill region can help with meeting the multiple objectives of 30 by 30, especially in the habitat and biodiversity conservation, recreation, and economic areas. And the blue box on the side shows a little bit of the current conservation in the Tug Hill region, as far as state lands and conservation easements, and got into trails a little bit. So there's a good bit of trails in the Tug Hill area. And then within the state's open space conservation plan, the Tug Hill is a conservation priority. I believe it's called the Tug Hill Core Forest. It's one of the main priority conservation projects in the open space plan, where the state is able to use funding from the Environmental Protection Fund land acquisition line for acquisitions. And then in the Tug Hill, we have a good example of how conservation can work with the local economy. So addressing a couple factors of the 30 by 30 legislation. All right. So, of course, one question is, how are we going to fund all this work? The sources that we have available presently, of course, we have the Clean Air, Clean Water, Green Jobs Bond Act that has a sizable chunk of funding available for open space conservation. And that can be worked through DEC, state parks, or through partners. And we're working on getting that funding flowing through existing and or new programs to reach our partners. And then other state funding sources, of course, the Environmental Protection Fund, as I mentioned, both the land acquisition line and the farmland protection lines. And then sometimes there's settlement funds available for land conservation. And then there's these federal programs listed here are just a snapshot. They're not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the funding programs that are available for your use within New York State through grant application process. And then some municipalities around the state have set up their own funding sources to protect land within their jurisdictional area. And then private conservation funds would be foundations, and those would mostly flow through land trust partners. One thing of note for municipal funding is that there's some municipalities in the state that have passed Community Protection Act, which is a real estate transfer tax at the local level. The similar funding source to the Environmental Protection Fund, but specific to a local community. And they have to have legislation passed at the state level and then have a voter referendum to impose that tax. And then planning on how to utilize the proceeds. Okay. So our next steps. I think, as I mentioned, public comment period on the strategies and methodology ended at the end of August. We're working on summarizing public comment and then preparing the final document. And we'll update the draft document in relation to the comments that we received. And then we'll be working on implementation. Kind of the first major step is incorporating 30 by 30 into the open space plan. And then doing some annual progress reporting and updates. as we go along. And one of the things in that final document will be a final definition of what we will be counting towards the 30 by 30 goal. We've received some comments on what we had proposed as a definition. So incorporating 30 by 30 into the open space plan, just a little update on where we are within that process. We're kind of in the middle of it right now. So each of the 9 regions that DEC sets up for its administrative purposes has a regional advisory committee formed of local representatives, both from county government and from the DEC and state parks commissioners. And they've provided us, we call it a regional advisory committee report, and that includes their land conservation priorities and their policy recommendations. And then the DEC and OPRHP will compile those reports, basically bringing out the land conservation priorities to form the statewide priority project list, and also bring those policy recommendations into the body of the plan itself as to how we proceed. And then we'll be working on plans for implementation for 30 by 30 and setting up priorities for what will be conserved and how, and incorporating the objectives from the legislation talked about earlier. So that is where we are on 30 by 30.
Perfect. I was just going to say, let's, we've got about 8 minutes for questions. So you were reading my mind, Jeff. Bryan, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, I was just going to say thanks, Jeff. That was a great overview. And I was just going to key into a couple of questions we had in the chat box to start at least. But while the public comment period is over, these comments that folks make here wouldn't end up being official comments. We definitely appreciate everyone's input. We've done a number of these listening sessions, and it really helps, folks like Jeff and I who've been working on this project, kind of key into our ideas. So, don't hold back if you guys have thoughts and you missed the comment period here. It's definitely, helpful to hear everyone's thoughts, regardless. So one question we did have, Jeff, that I see here was in regards to the freshwater wetlands numbers in our calculations and if they would change when the new regs take effect. And, I can try to at least start with the answer there is that, we've calculated the wetlands acreage based on current regulations and not the future regulations. And once those regs do take effect and we can kind of get that geospatial overview actually mapped out, then we would have better numbers for those and would definitely be updating. That also said, we are continuing to refine the protected layers lands layer that we have, finding new things that are protected that weren't included in those. And, that effort is going to continue as we move towards 2030.
Thank you for that. And I think there's a couple of questions here around the Community Preservation Act fund, and apparently there must be a bill awaiting the governor's signature. I'm not sure. I'm not tracking that topic, but maybe you guys have some insight.
I don't know of a bill. Jeff did touch on that topic when you were talking earlier. What I would say is, the fund or the act itself wouldn't count towards 30 by 30, but the lands that are protected from it, if they're protected from conversion, from wildlands to, development or something like that, those would count. So, that's sort of where we would draw the line on something like that. And that could be a fantastic tool to achieving the work of 30 by 30.
Thank you. And John recaps his public comment. How much land is not yet recognized due to outdated local records? I know you can only do, the best you can with the information you have. I mean, I don't know if you have any sense of how far off you think you could be because of outdated or not available data.
I'm not sure how much exactly we'd be off, but I do know that I've looked at it myself, and I know of spots around where I live that are not in there that probably should be. It was based on tax coding, so I think there's definitely some effort there, and also looking at there's some additional lands to bring in from land trusts as well. If you look at the 2015 land trust census, that number is higher than what is in NIPAD presently, but we've been doing outreach and have been working with several land trusts to try and bring that in.
Thank you. Matthew's got his hand raised and he's unmuted. Go ahead, Matthew.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to let you know the community preservation bill did not leave the Senate or the House. So it's not at the governor's desk. But what Tracy Shu said in the chat was about 2 smaller towns that pursued it independently. And I also wanted to add to what Jeff said, it would not help with the funding for this particular need, but what it does is allow municipalities to independently raise the monies in order to match all the different federal, state, and private funding that's out there. So it's essential they get that. And the 2 municipalities that Tracy just referenced have been trying to do this for quite a few years, but the state has been at it for decades. The person who sponsored it from Eastern Long Island just retired. I think there'll be new sponsors that will take it up, but there is a need for a statewide pressure on elected officials to pass this. It's the most democratic process. It's a win-win-win. I could speak more about it. I won't take up your time, but it does, it checks all the boxes. It can preserve water. You could preserve historic areas. You could do everything with this, and it saves the taxpayer money in the long run. It's a real estate transfer tax. If anyone's interested in learning more or wants to get active in their community, please let Jillian know, and she's going to know who to contact or forward your message to. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions and we've got about only 2 minutes till we switch gears here. So one quick question, where are the marine protected areas?
I believe those are all in the Long Island area.
Okay, and then talking about working with planning departments as well to help update those records, but I know they live with real property, so there's just some silos there that it's a process to get that done. Do we have any other questions for Jeff or for Bryan before we switch gears? Yeah, I think if not, thank you very much. That was very informative. Appreciate it's very up to date. It's an evolving topic for sure and a hot topic. So I think that was great for this group to hear. So again, thank you, Bryan and Jeff, for that. And with that, we will switch gears and get Jennifer Manierre's presentation up here. You should be able to share. I think I've given you co-host. See if we can get that to work. Looks good. Just got to put it in PowerPoint mode.
Yep, that's what I was going to ask.
Yep.
Slideshow. Are we seeing just a screen full of one slide now?
Just one slide now. Yep.
Beautiful.
Perfect.
Okay. So
Jennifer's with the Clean Energy Siting Group at NYSERDA, and she's going to talk about 70 by 30. It's all you.
That's right. Thank you. Pleasure to be here today. 70 by 30 is not typically the topic of the presentations that I give. And in my opinion, getting to 70% renewables by 2030 involves a lot of stuff. So you may be a little bit overwhelmed by the slides that I'm about to show, because I'm doing a little bit of throw some spaghetti at the wall, hoping that something sticks with some of you folks, because it's hard to know really what particular aspects of getting all of these renewables online is most interesting to you. So I'm also going to try and leave plenty of time at the end for questions in case there are topics I didn't cover. Happy to, chat about any of this stuff in more detail, but I did my best. So here we go. Assuming, I never like to assume that everyone has the same baseline level of knowledge. So I'm going to take just a couple quick minutes and just talk about some of the predominant technologies that we're talking about when we talk about renewables, and just know that this is also not all encompassing. So solar, a lot of you have probably heard a lot about this and feel like you sort of know what it is. This will a tiny bit deeper of a dive. There are multiple different types of solar. There's concentrated solar that you typically see more out in a desert or something like that, where they're using mirrors to reflect sunlight into a common point and like heat up a fluid to turn generators. That's not really what we're talking about too much in New York. There's also solar thermal, which is really just taking radiation from the sun, heating up water, using it for space heating, that sort of thing. Typically when we're talking about solar here in New York, we're talking about solar photovoltaics and turning the sun sort of directly into electricity. These are the panels that you're familiar with. You've probably seen it on your neighbors' houses, out in a field somewhere, things like that. There's a few different types: residential, sort of self-explanatory, commercial, and these are what we refer to as behind the meter systems. So they're really typically designed to serve the building or the load, if you will, that they are, co-located with. If they're on the house, the energy is going to that house. If they're in the side yard of a commercial facility, they're designed to, feed energy to that commercial facility. I'm going to skip over community solar for a minute and go utility scale. These are those much larger systems you might see out in the country somewhere, taking up perhaps dozens, in some cases even hundreds of acres. And they function like a typical power plant would, just feeding electricity directly into the grid and letting the electrons go where they will. We refer to those as front of the meter because they are literally in front of a meter, whereas the ones on your house would be located behind your meter and sort of directly debit your electricity. And somewhere in the middle there is community solar, not typically co-located with the end user, but it can be tied to your bill and function as if it's behind the meter. So for example, if you're a resident and you subscribe to a community solar project somewhere near your town, you sort of like rent a portion or a few panels, if you will, of that project, and whatever electricity is generated from there sort of comes off your electric bill. So while it's not physically behind the meter, it kind of functions as if it is. So just a little bit of a primer there. And if we're talking about ground mounted solar, just for a little bit of context, 5 to 7 acres, maybe more like 5 to 6 acres even now per megawatt of solar. And for a little bit of scale, that might feed, 1 to 200 homes per megawatt. Wind energy, also getting pretty popular, even though it's been around for a while. Not going to get into every detail here. We have a little diagram there if you'd like to learn the names of the components on a wind turbine. We are seeing increasing turbine sizes and capacities. I would say some of the older projects that have been built for a while might be 2 to 3 megawatts. I think some of the new ones that are going in are probably closer to 4 or 5. And they're getting taller and they're getting bigger. And in general, onshore wind turbines are going to be a little bit smaller than offshore wind turbines. In order to accommodate all of the renewable energy that we have going onto the grid, the sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing, and we need energy all the time, right? So enter energy storage. Typically, what we're seeing now is lithium-ion batteries. They can be located, at the residential level or at the commercial level, much like how I described solar. And they can also be utility scale systems out front of the meter, just sort of plugging into the grid, taking energy off the grid when there's too much being generated and putting it back on the grid when there's not enough being generated and we need it. So that's one use of it. It can also be used as backup power in a home or business. It can be used to, defer grid upgrades and save money there. So if there's a point on the grid that's sort of congested, You can, locate energy storage either, before or after that point of congestion so that you don't have to upgrade the grid itself while still getting power when you need it. And again, not going to deep dive into this stuff, but just wanted to give everyone a little flavor. But if you want to dive into it during the Q&A, happy to do so. But why are we doing this all? This is sort of my doom and gloom slide, if you will, just highlighting some of the negative repercussions that we might expect to see from climate change in the coming years in different parts of the state. Not going to go through every one of them, but down by New York City, we're looking at things like sea level rise, maybe heat-related deaths are increasing. In other parts of the state, we might see, milk production losses. We might see more snow in some areas, less snow in others, affecting recreation, things like that. So there's some doom and gloom associated with climate change that we're trying to avoid by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, by replacing our fossil fuel energy sources with renewables that are emissions free, right? So that's one of the reasons we're doing this. But I would say even aside from the doom and gloom there are plenty of other reasons to implement clean energy and do renewables aside from that. Improved public health, increased US energy dependence, right? We don't have to rely on other countries to supply us with the fuel that we need. We can make our own clean domestic energy right here at home. Job creation throughout the renewable energy industries, from building the stuff to installing the stuff, repairing, all of those things, plenty of opportunities for job creation, which is great. And of course, reduced carbon emissions and air pollution to avoid some of the negative repercussions that I showed on the last slide. It also can help enhance grid reliability and security and resilience of the grid, if you will, particularly with respect to energy storage and the resilience there. And perhaps more broadly, some renewables can help expand clean energy access for folks that are not connected to the grid and live in more remote areas. So lots and lots of reasons to implement renewables and clean energy, aside from just trying to mitigate the impacts of climate change, right? There's lots of good reasons to do it all on its own, even if it weren't for that. So how is New York going about doing this? In 2019, we saw the Community Leadership and Community Protection Act come into effect, and that is what set our 70% renewable energy on the grid by 2030 goal that you can see over here, sort of in the middle of that timeline chart on the right there. In 2020, we saw the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act come into play. That's what created the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which is streamlined and sort of fast-tracked state-level permitting for those larger utility-scale renewable energy projects. In 2022, the Climate Action Council released a scoping plan, which is sort of a more detailed framework for how to go about implementing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act from 2019. And then finally, this year, just a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, maybe, the governor hosted the Future Energy Economy Summit, which talks about some other technologies aside from renewables that are, going to help us reach all of these goals. And further, this year, we're kicking off the state energy plan process to update the state energy plan. I think we're hoping to have that completed by the end of next year. And so that'll lay out an updated roadmap for like the next 15 years, I believe, for how we're going to go about doing all of these, wonderful energy things that the state has been tasked with doing. And the little timeline on the chart there just shows all of the different targets that are in the CLCPA. I'll point out a couple of them. We have a goal of 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar by 2025. I think we're well on our way to achieving that goal. And when I say distributed solar, I'm talking about residential, commercial, and those community solar projects. So like 5 megawatts and under, not the large utility scale projects. We have a further goal out in 2030 to have 10,000 megawatts of distributed solar implemented. And of course, the framework for what I'm talking about here today, that 70% renewable energy goal by 2030 to help make all of those happen. We have some battery storage goals. This graphic is actually already outdated. It says 6,000 megawatts for battery energy storage was announced. It's actually an official goal now, which is great. And then there's some other ones as well. We want to get 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind online by 2035 and 100% zero emissions electricity grid by 2040. You'll notice it says 100% zero emissions and not 100% renewable energy. We're not necessarily looking to get 100% of the grid powered with renewable energy. It is likely not feasible by then. So hence the Future Energy Economy Summit, that last bullet over here on the left-hand side, looking at what other technologies we can implement that will help enable the transition to renewables. For example, advanced nuclear was I think a hot topic that day. All right, so talking about some of the benefits of doing all of this stuff. If you look at the Climate Action Council scoping plan, there's some financial analyses in there, right? And I think, and it lays out sort of different scenarios of certain things that we can do to try to get to those goals, different ways of going about doing it. So this chart on the right shows on the left-hand side of it, of just a strategic use of low carbon fuels. In the middle, it's showing the analysis of an accelerated transition away from combustion. And then all the way on the right, going above and beyond 85% reductions beyond 1990 levels, and sort of looking at the costs and benefits of doing those things. But don't get bogged down in all of the numbers and colors. The important thing here is that for all three of those scenarios, the net benefit outweighs the cost of doing those things. And that's what you see in the black boxes that are circled in near the top of all of those. So while it may be expensive to do the things that we're doing, and I think a lot of folks tend to focus on the, what it costs sometimes, it's really important to remember that the net benefits are real and the benefits outweigh the costs, which is great. Good stuff to be doing. I need to move my little thing out of my slide here. Okay. Some other notable efforts and investments from the state. Like I said, I'm a little bit throwing spaghetti at the wall here, not sure what everyone is particularly interested in. But aside from, putting our money behind and trying to support renewables themselves, like I said, we're looking at the grid. So NYSERDA's run a Tier 4 program, which is basically trying to fund upgrades to the grid in certain points and try to get as much clean energy down to the city as we can, because it's one of our big demand loads, but it's not the only thing that's going on, right? There are other investments going on in the grid across the state. Don't try to read this all right now, but on the top right-hand side of your screen, you can see some of the new transmission projects that are going in the state. Maybe, if you decide to look at these slides later, you'll see some of them have been implemented. Some of them are in the works right now, like under construction, and others are, sort of identified as a need to do at a future date. But the point here is there's a lot of investments going into the grid in order to support all of this renewable energy coming online, but it's also just a net benefit to the grid anyway, make it more robust and resilient as we have more storms and things like that that could affect it. In the renewables realm, we have a lot of different things going on trying to support that. NYSERDA has a New York Sun program that provides funding for residential, commercial, and community solar projects. So we're talking like 5 megawatts and under. We also have a Build Ready program, which is where NYSERDA is trying to target underutilized sites to try and develop renewable energy on them. So we're talking brownfields, landfills, old industrial sites. So we have a team of folks that are trying to get sites like that sort of pre-developed and de-risked and ready for renewable energy development, and then auction those off to private developers to actually build and operate. NYPA, the New York Public Authority, has some renewed powers, if you will, to start building public renewables. We have a whole program dedicated to getting offshore wind implemented, which is wonderful because it ends up being very close to, the biggest load pocket in the state, if you will, which is New York City. And you can see the map of some of the offshore wind projects that are in the works, and also just some of the lease areas that may have wind projects in the future on the bottom right-hand side there. I already mentioned energy storage. Of course, again, sun doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So we need some backup energy storage to help make it feasible. Lots of other 100% by 2040 activities. Again, that's 100% clean electric grid by 2040. And I think we'll touch on a couple of those later. And on top of that, I couldn't even begin to get into all of the different energy efficiency, electrification, weatherization programs that we have, but know that they exist. So there's a lot going on. All right, clean energy in context. So I think this map on the top right-hand side of the screen, I think is very telling because I travel around the state a lot and meet with different towns. And I think a lot of folks believe or think that all of the large renewable energy projects that are being proposed in upstate New York are only being cited there to, you know, be funneled down and supply New York City. And that's simply not the case. So this map here shows some of the new larger load projects that are coming into the state up here that also need power, right? One of them being Micron in the Syracuse area. They're looking at 480 additional megawatts of demand. So there's a lot going on. We have a lot of power needs, and trying to meet them with renewables is going to take a lot of work. But there's a lot of benefits, like I showed on some of the other slides, and it can be a really meaningful driver of economic development and job creation, like I alluded to earlier. It can also be a great way to bring in funding from other sources, even outside of the state, like the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of federal funding available for doing clean energy projects, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, which is looking at getting chip manufacturing facilities up and running. And I think in New York even has a complement to that to provide funding, the Green CHIPS Act. So lots of, you know, economic development and jobs can be associated with all of the clean energy that we're trying to put in the 70 by 30 goals. And that map on the bottom right there, this is a live link, and you can check out some of the federal funding that's been coming into New York State through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, if you're interested. So my team, which I actually neglected to sort of mention during my intro at the beginning here, most of our role consists of working with local governments and helping them prepare for the larger projects that are coming into their towns. So I assume there are some folks like that on the call here that might be involved in their local planning. So I always like to point out, I know there are, you know, some considerations with things that are coming in. You might be worried about different impacts that the projects are going to have on your community. And all of these different impacts that you see on the screen here are things that my team would be available to like meet with you or provide educational sessions on. We can talk about, you know, how to tax renewable projects. We can go into detail about agricultural land impacts and how to mitigate them. Always happy to have a discussion on fire safety associated with any energy storage. All of these things I know folks tend to be concerned about and have questions. And I just want you to know that we're here to help you understand what's going on there. I think people are also tend to be interested in, you know, how do these projects get permitted? There may be a little bit of a misconception that the state has, you know, authority over perhaps more than it does. So I like to point out how that works. And it really does vary based on the size and the type of installation. For solar and wind, anything under 25 megawatts is going to be permitted at the local level. The local government has, you know, full authority over those under 25 megawatt projects. Anything larger is going to be permitted at the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which, like I said, is a relatively new agency that was created under the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act that was implemented in 2020. And then for energy storage, if there's energy storage co-located or paired with one of those large scale greater than 25 megawatt projects in the bullets above, that will be permitted at the state level along with the renewable energy source that it is co-located with. If it's standalone energy storage, that's going to be local government permitting as well. So plenty of control there. And this is just a nice little plug here for my team. And like I mentioned, we're here to help folks understand what is going on with all of these different technologies and how local governments and communities can prepare for it. One of the ways we're going about doing that, other than meeting with folks and doing presentations like this one, is we've developed written materials. So you can see the 5 different guidebooks on different topics that we have available on our website for you to peruse. Also always welcome to reach out at cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov. So we have a clean energy in your comprehensive plan guide for local governments, a solar guidebook. That one's about an inch thick if you print it out. I don't recommend doing that. It's a lot of paper. We have an energy storage guidebook for local governments, a wind energy guidebook for local governments, and the newest addition to our collection is an Inflation Reduction Act guide for local governments to help them take advantage of some of the funding associated with the IRA. And some of the next few slides here, I might breeze through some of these because I think we're going to be coming up on time fairly soon. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of where some of these projects are going in and how they're distributed around the state. So this image here shows the projects that from New York Sun, which, like I said, are residential, commercial, up through community solar projects. However, it is not showing residential projects because the whole map would probably be yellow because there are residential projects everywhere. It also shows energy storage and some of those other sort of distributed technologies. NYSERDA also does an annual solicitation for large-scale renewables. So it's a competitive process whereby those larger utility scale solar, wind, hydro, energy storage projects come in. They're competitively selected. We typically award maybe 20 per year. This is a little bit old, but it was the latest image I could find to just sort of give you a snapshot of the types of projects that are typically funded through that annual solicitation. If you've been paying attention, you might know we've had a little bit of attrition over the last year or so. Some projects that were previously awarded had to drop out due to the economy, which I'm not going to go into now. But we're expecting to sort of reaward a lot of them in the future. So don't look at this image right here and assume that all of these projects are necessarily still set in stone from this. But I just wanted to give you a snapshot of what one of our typical solicitation award groups might look like. So like I said, somewhere in the ballpark of like 20 large projects. In this particular group, we were looking at $4 billion of direct investment created or projected, 4,100 jobs created, lots and lots of carbon emissions reductions. Look at like 440,000 cars taken off the road annually, and we do this every year. If you see one of a large solar or wind project proposed in your town, more likely than not, it's going to have a contract through NYSERDA's large-scale renewable solicitation. I also mentioned earlier, we have this big load down in New York City, right? And it's really hard to get all of the energy generated down there. So we've had to reinforce the grid basically and upgrade it to get some of that energy down there. And we did that through a similar competitive solicitation called our Tier 4 program, and we awarded the 2 projects you saw on the screen, and they are, in the process of getting built and also have a lot of their own economic developments associated with them as well. For example, 10,000 jobs, $8.2 billion in economic development investments, and so on. And the next few slides, we're sort of zooming into Tug Hill a little bit, but you could do this, no matter where in the state you're from. I wanted to give folks an idea of the types of tools and information that's out there to help you plan for renewable energy in your community, right? So this map shows transmission lines that are sort of going around the Tug Hill region. I don't have the GIS skills to do an exact boundary of Tug Hill itself. So we just kind of picked the counties there for a good enough illustration of what's going on. So you have to imagine large solar and wind projects are typically going to need to be somewhere near a transmission line. So this can help you sort of imagine where future projects might be able to be sited if you know where those lines are. And there's a source for those down in the bottom right. And what's already installed, right? What are you currently working with? And this map is available. I believe we have this on NYSERDA's website. I'll have to get the link out to you for that. But you can, click on your county or click on a region and see what's already installed for distributed solar, for example. So the counties around Tug Hill collectively account for less than 1% of the number of distributed solar projects in the state. Again, distributed being those relatively smaller solar projects, but approximately 6% of the capacity. So maybe the projects in this area tend to be a tiny bit larger on average than the rest of state. Storage, similar picture here. You got 63 storage projects installed. Again, 1% of the projects, but 15% of the capacity. So I guess your storage projects tend to be a little bit bigger. I don't know if we have to dive into, if we could dive into why that is right now, but it's interesting nonetheless. And just know that these tools are available for you to see what's going on in your area. Similar to the map I showed earlier that showed the transmission lines, there are separate maps for the hosting capacity for your local distribution lines. For example, national grid lines. And anyone, again, these are publicly available, and you can tell how much room is available, like how much additional capacity those lines have based on the color on the map. So there's a key here. Blue lines have more available space, if you will, for a solar project or a wind project to sort of plug in and put more energy on the grid. And as you go down and get closer to, you know, red and purple, there's less capacity on those lines for those renewable energy projects to connect and inject more electricity onto the grid. So I would say in those areas, it is less likely that you're going to see a project. So again, just sort of showing you a snapshot of the types of tools and information that are out there for planning purposes. On top of, you know, the distribution and transmission lines, you can also look at the New York ISO, which is our system operator. They basically run the grid, and they have an interconnection queue, which is where you can see where large projects have like put an application in to say, hey, we're interested in building a project and interconnecting to the grid. You know, do a study and let us know if there's enough room. And again, that interconnection queue is publicly available. This is a live link. So if you're interested in seeing, you know, potential projects that may be coming into your area, particularly the large ones, you can always check out the New York ISO interconnection queue. Not every project that's in that queue is going to come to fruition. In fact, a lot of them probably won't. They tend to fall off for one reason or another. Some permit didn't get granted, the financials didn't work out, what have you. But it's still an interesting way to see what might be coming down the pike, right? And then the same is true for the local distribution lines. It's similar to the New York ISO queue, but they, for example, submitted application to National Grid saying, hey, we're thinking about building a project, we'd like to interconnect, and you can see a list of those projects on, for example, the National Grid queue, and all of the investor-owned utilities are going to have public information like this too. Again, doesn't necessarily mean a project's going to happen. It just means someone's thinking about it and is interested in seeing if they can connect. I mentioned that my team works with local governments to help them prepare for all of this development coming in. One of the things we do is provide model zoning laws for solar and energy storage. And we've been trying to track, you know, who has zoning laws, who doesn't have zoning laws for these technologies, who's prepared, things like that. So another interesting way of looking at what's going on in your area is, you know, which towns have implemented energy storage laws. And I'm not showing this to call anyone out and say, oh, you know, Wilna has an active energy storage law and Libre has a moratorium. One's necessarily better than the other, but it gives you a good idea of what's going on. And what I would say is probably the communities that don't have a law or moratorium, you know, on the books right now might be the ones that I could proactively help if you happen to be in one of those and you're interested in being prepared and having some zoning on the books for energy storage, for example. Again, reach out to my team. You could do the same type of map with solar. I don't have that on the slides, but just know you can. All right, so wrapping up, whirlwind here. Looking toward the future, I mentioned earlier that we are kicking off the process of redoing the state energy plan. Public comments are going to be welcome throughout that process. The link to find everything you need to know about it is right here on the right-hand side of this screen, energyplan.ny.gov. Hopefully some of you have some great feedback for us on that. And I'd also mentioned a couple weeks ago, the governor hosted a future energy economy summit, looking at, you know, other clean energy technologies, not just renewables, and, you know, how we can implement them to help us meet all of our goals. There is also an advanced nuclear technologies blueprint on this website. And again, this is a live link here, and we're accepting feedback on that as well. So if that's something you're interested in, welcome all the public feedback on that. So just wanted to tee up a little bit of the future stuff. And again, shameless plug for my team's technical assistance here, our guidebooks, our, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. Again, it's just Clean Energy Help at NYSERDA. And this is my team's website. Happy to take questions, comments, discussion.
Thank you, Jen. We do have one comment or question in the chat right now. Please, everyone, add things to the chat. So Allison says, do large-scale renewables that apply for / receive NYSERDA solicitation funding have to meet additional or different requirements related to planning, permitting, due diligence phases of the project to receive the funding? How are the projects that successfully receive funding selected?
Oh boy. So I don't have all of the requirements of our large scale renewable solicitation memorized, but we do have plenty of our own. For example, every project that submits a proposal has to fill out a smart siting scorecard, for example, so we can see, how much ag land are you affecting? Are you planning on incorporating agrivoltaics or agriculture and co-location with your solar project, for example? Like what sorts of great things you're doing, and that affects the scoring, for example, there. Otherwise, depending on the size of the project, who ultimately permits them is going to be the same as the slide that I shared earlier. So if it ends up being a 20 megawatt solar project, for example, it's still going to be in the hands of the local government to say yay or nay and go through the seeker process, just like you would for anything else. If it's a larger one, ORES is going to be in charge of permitting those projects. And I think it's also important to know that for those large utility scale projects, they do not receive funding from NYSERDA until they are pushing green electrons into the grid, until they are operational and flip the switch on. What we do when we award projects through that solicitation is award them a contract for purchase of renewable energy certificates. It basically says, if you build this project and produce the green electrons, at the point when you start doing that, NYSERDA will purchase renewable energy certificates from you, at X dollar amount per megawatt hour. So we're not just putting money out the door and sort of crossing our fingers and hoping they will be built. They don't get anything from us until it's actually built. And so all of the other environmental studies and things like that would have to be done otherwise absolutely do have to.
So that's a good point. And that's where you say that some of the things that did get a REC announcement, they've fallen through. So the money never went to the company. That's why you're redistributing some of that to other projects.
Yep. We ended up, a lot of them had to back out of their contracts. It's probably a whole nother discussion. And we ended up running an expedited solicitation to try and, get some of them back in, because we couldn't just say, oh, you had supply chain issues and your costs went up, let us give you more money, because we had a contract for a certain dollar amount. So we had to have a whole new competitor.
I'm happy to see that you have the IRA guide. I wasn't aware of that one. I knew about the other four, because I do think there's a lot of opportunities for local governments to do some clean energy things themselves, and navigating the IRA money is a challenge as far as I can tell. I haven't spent a lot of time on it, but so thank you for that. I guess I was not able to go to the conference in Syracuse about nuclear a couple weeks ago. I've heard about it. I'm kind of curious, like, where do you see, and I know you probably maybe can't answer this, but it's early days, but we've got large nuclear reactors in Oswego County, which is not in Tug Hill, but in one of our counties. And the process to build another one would take a long time, but there's probably some interest in that locally. I know there's new technology, the small modular reactors coming out, and I'm kind of wondering where that fits into the whole picture here, if you have any thoughts on that.
Honestly, I don't think I'm qualified to have my own independent thoughts on that. But what I would say is check out let me see if I can go back a couple slides. The Advanced Nuclear Technologies Blueprint that we do have shared online, that's open for public feedback. And I'm hoping that might answer some of your questions. And the summit, for folks that were not able to attend, I wasn't able to attend in person either. The whole thing was recorded and it's posted online if you want to sit back and relax for 7 hours or whatever it was. It was really interesting though. I was able to virtually catch a lot of it.
Okay, good to know. So we have a question here. The presentation went very quickly. Could you send some links to some of the data sources? I'm assuming that everything that looks like a live link in your presentation will be live when we share it as a PDF.
Yep.
Okay, so there should be lots of links. It is a lot of information, and honestly, so this is the last thing of the day. My eyes are starting to glaze over from looking at the screen.
Yeah.
It's a lot of.
Never expect anyone to absorb all of it. Like I said, I was kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall. So maybe you heard something that you're interested in, and now you know it exists and can go dig into it a little bit more.
And it also feels like things are changing. Like, I think probably 6 months ago, I went on to try to find some of that transmission line capacity GIS data, and I couldn't find it. And then yet you had a couple of nice maps in there that you had specified for the Tyco counties that might be useful. I'm hoping that's digestible as a GIS layer, because it's always good to put that in your own, projects and mapping sort of thing. So it sounds like there's a lot of evolution happening pretty fast.
It's drinking from a fire hose every day.
Yeah. Other questions or comments for Jennifer?
Yeah, and Katie, I know I sent you guys a PDF the other day. I rearranged a couple of things, and I think I may have even added a link or two. So let me share a new one before you send it out.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there'll be a follow-up email to everybody. It might not go out until early next week, honestly, and it'll have links to all the folders where all the recordings, all the handouts will be well organized and viewable, because it is a lot. And I know there were other presentations going on simultaneously today that people might have wanted to see.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Everybody's tired. I think Jillian, you're on. I don't know if we want to just transition to the wrap up right now. Maybe get people out of here a few minutes early. I don't know.
That sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that presentation, Jen.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me. And like I said, feel free to reach out anytime.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the 2024 NYSAC Conference on the Environment, the virtual portion. We really appreciate you being able to be here with us today. We hope that you enjoyed the talks. And like Katie mentioned, we have recorded the presentations, and we will have those available to you. I will be sending out an email next week with the recording, with a link to the recordings and some of the presentations, and also a survey as well. If you could please take that, that would be fantastic. Again, if you have any other further questions, please feel free to reach out to me, but we really appreciate you guys being here and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
For those that are members of NYSAC, I think you're going to another link, I'm not sure where, for your annual meeting. So don't forget about that if you are a NYSAC member.